Welcome to the Dairy News and Views podcast, a production of the Iowa State University Extension and Outreach Dairy Team. Our podcast covers current educational, research, and industry tools available for your operation to manage healthy cows and calves while producing the highest quality dairy products.
Thanks for joining us today on Dairy News and Views from the Iowa State University Dairy Team. I'm Fred Hall, Northwest Iowa Dairy Field Specialist. I'm here with Jen Bentley, Northeast Iowa Dairy Field Specialist, as we discuss today's topic. Welcome back to the podcast, Jen.
Thanks, Fred, and glad to be back on. I think you picked a very timely topic as we talk about some of these new genetic summaries coming through here in December. So looking forward to the discussion.
Dr. Koltes joins us as an assistant professor in animal breeding and genetics. He previously was an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville in the animal science department. Dr. Koltes received his BS in dairy science and genetics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and PhD from Iowa State University in genetics. Dr. Koltes has worked on genomics research in a variety of species, often at the interface between molecular and quantitative genetics. His research at Iowa State focused on the use of genetics and genomics to develop more disease and stress-resistant dairy cattle. Dr. Koltes, welcome to the ISU Dairy Team podcast.
Hi, Fred. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Dr. Koltes, you presented information on the changes producers will see in the new Sire Summaries last week at our monthly dairy webinar. Give us an overview of the traits and indexes you'll be covering in today's podcast and just how important they are in the world of dairy genetics.
Today, I'm going to discuss the new feed saved trait, which is a feed efficiency measure, as well as heifer livability, which is a new measure of the ability of heifers to survive from shortly after birth until about 18 months of age. And we'll talk a little bit about how these two new traits are going to fit into the net merit index. And I'm very excited, particularly about the feed saved trait. It has a large economic value, and I think it'll have a big impact on the industry.
Dr. Koltes, let's first talk about that feed saved or that predicted transmitting ability feed saved trait. And what does that mean for our producers and how is that calculated?
Sure. So feed saved as the predicted transmitting ability is going to be the difference in the genetic potential of what a parent transmits to its offspring in terms of the pounds of feed saved in a lactation. And so that value is calculated adjusting for differences in the dry matter intake of that animal. It takes into account the body weight, as larger animals tend to require more energy. And it also adjusts for things like our typical production traits, milk and components, to make sure that as we're trying to select to improve feed efficiency, that we're not inadvertently harming any of the other traits we want to select for.
What does feed saved look like in real life? What kind of variation will we see in the different breeds? Holsteins first.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Fred. And I should mention that right now the evaluation is only available in Holsteins. And in the future, we're hoping that the evaluation will be available in other breeds as well. What we're looking at in terms of feed saved is that a more positive value is better. The more positive a value, that means the more feed saved for a given cow in terms of its genetics. So in cows themselves right now, we're looking at somewhere in the ballpark of 900 pounds variability that's been observed in the data for dry matter intake in our cows. In bulls, we're actually looking at a much larger difference, almost 1,500 pounds. But keep in mind, those are for the extremes. So for the typical animal, we're going to see something more on the order of maybe 100 to 200 pounds of difference in feed intake per lactation.
So we talk about the differences, the variation within the Holsteins, but then what are some of those major differences with feed saved in our bulls?
So among Holstein bulls, right now, the majority of the population differs by somewhere in the orderhood of around 100 pounds. So about 68% of the Holstein bulls deviate between plus 109 and minus 109 pounds. And what that means is a plus 109 PTA feed saved means they're going to save you 109 pounds in a lactation. They're going to be that much more feed efficient, versus a minus 109 means they're going to be more inefficient. So from the extremes, if you will, within that most common group, we're looking at a little over a 200 pounds difference in the daughters, these bulls per lactation. So if you think about that over 3 lactations, if that difference was between the maximums within that common group, 218 pounds by 3 lactations, we're talking about 654 pounds of feed over a lifetime, which can really add up.
When we compare the feed saved to other traits in our selections, how does it compare? What's the repeatability?
Sure. So the feed saved trait, and I'll back up for a moment. I'll also discuss the heritability. It's a little bit lower. It's closer to the somatic cell count that we see currently in the industry at 0.14. Along with that, it also means that it typically takes a little bit more information to have a reliable estimate of that genetic value. So the values are a little bit lower than we're accustomed to. The average is going to come in the 30 percentile. The reliabilities for our average bull for feed safe are going to come in the low 30% range as the data that's being collected is coming primarily from research farms. Feed intake data is expensive to collect. And so currently there's a lot of research being done to try to find either alternative ways to measure at a cheaper level or proxy traits that give us additional information about feed saved. So the big challenge right now is being able to collect enough data from feed intake, since it's expensive to measure.
And Dr. Koltes, I think you kind of answered my next question about why the reliabilities are so low, but would you anticipate that, as we get more data, that number could increase?
Yeah, certainly. And so the folks at USDA who have been involved in development of the feed safe prediction, along with Dr. Templeman at Michigan State, have done a little bit of prognostication kind of for how the reliabilities are going to come along. So as we add more data throughout the current feed efficiency trial that's going on that Iowa State participates in, we expect to see those reliabilities come up closer to 40%. And if we can find other measurements that may be helpful, maybe we can get that reliability a bit higher.
What are the expected economics or impact of feed save?
So feed saved on an annual basis right now is projected to save the industry somewhere in the neighborhood of $8.4 million, even with the lower reliabilities that we're seeing at present. And that's really driven by the fact that feed is so expensive and such a driver of profitability on the dairy.
Can you talk a little bit more about the current feed intake data collection or the ongoing research that you're doing at ISU?
Sure, and I'll add, kind of following up on your previous comment, just imagine as we get more data and become more reliable, those differences will become larger and larger. So at present, there are a little over 6,000 animals that have contributed data for feed intake. And that really comes from 2 different research projects. A large study that was funded by USDA from 2010 to 2015 that contributed about 4,700 animals. And then a newer project funded by FFAR, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and the Council for Dairy Cattle Breeding. We currently have about 1,478 cows, and we'll add about another 2,200 on top of that to bring our total up close to 10,000 animals. And moving forward, this new project from FAR and CDCB is going to also allow us to test the use of some new things, such as milk spectra that we get from our DHI milk testing, as well as different types of sensor data. And these are areas especially related to sensor data that we're working on at Iowa State.
In the webinar, you talked about the heifer livability. Explain what that is and what is the data behind this trait?
Sure. So heifer livability, predicted transmitting ability, is the expected survival of an animal's female offspring from 2 days of birth up to 18 months of age in a herd with average management conditions. And so for this trait, a larger value is better. This data is available currently for both Holsteins and Jerseys, so it will impact both breeds, and based on about 3.4 million heifers worth of data from 2009 to 2016.
What are the new genomic PTAs, and what changes will we see in the indexes coming in April?
Besides the two traits that we just talked about, the heifer livability and feed saved, which will both have genomic proofs, we're also going to see genomic PTAs become available for 6 different type traits that were available for some breeds previously, but now are going to come online for more of those breeds. So that includes rear udder width, which will now be available for all breeds. Body depth is being added for Ayrshire and Guernsey. Feet and leg score mobility is being added for Brown Swiss. Milking speed is being added for Brown Swiss. Rear teat rear view is being added for Jerseys, and rear teat side view is being added for Jerseys. And most of these traits are looking to have a reliability somewhere in the ballpark of 51 to 73% for these genomic proofs. Then you had asked about the impact of some of these traits on the index coming up. In particular, for feed saved and heifer livability, those 2 traits are looking to impact the April update to the net merit index. And so right now, we don't know for sure what the weights are going to be, but based on the presentations that have been made from Dr. Paul Van Reyden at USDA, we're expecting about a 1% weight, maybe a little bit less than that for heifer livability, and a 14% weight on feed saved. And so, in thinking about what that means, feed saved would rank in at about the 3rd highest weight after our fat and protein traits. And heifer livability would be one of the traits somewhat lower in the list of traits in the index. And that's all determined based on their economic impact on overall profitability.
Is this changes coming about now because it's a before and after genomics question?
That's a really interesting question, Fred. I think some of it certainly is that way. We've got certain types of data like feed intake that are really expensive. And so in the past, we would have had to go through progeny test. It would have cost a lot of money. We would have had to test lots and lots of offspring from each individual bull. Whereas today with genomics, we can do testing in selective herds, say in university herds or specific industry herds that have a representative genetic pool from the breed, Holsteins in this case, and then use genomics to transfer that information across the animal. And so really, this is a great example of how genomics can save us a lot of money in terms of transferring genetic information from bulls to cows.
Dr. Koltes, you gave us a lot of different things that are changing in the genetic evaluation. Are there other big changes that you want to explain or let the industry know about at this point?
I'll mention briefly that earlier this year, we did have a change to the genetic base. So every 5 years, we update our PTAs such that we sort of recenter them. We move the zero, if you will, the zero value for a PTA to the average for the breed. And we do that so that when we make comparisons, they're realistic. We don't want really inflated values. We want to have an idea of how today's dairy cow or today's dairy bull ranks to a modern animal. And so that's why we make that change. And it allows us also to be able to see the amount of genetic change that we're making that way, because we see that adjustment in how those PTAs change. Probably the biggest change we saw in terms of traits was with the calving ease genetic evaluation. And that's because we hadn't done an adjustment before for the mean. And so we went from having incidence of calving difficulty up around 8% to somewhere now closer to 2 or 3% within the Holstein breed. And so when we've adjusted for that average, our values look a lot smaller. They look quite a bit different. And so that base change really has impacted the way that we look at our calving ease PTAs from bulls. But it's a good thing, actually. It goes to show that as a breed within Holsteins, we've really improved and decreased the number of difficult births for those Holstein bull progeny.
Thanks for all the great information here today, Dr. Koltes. And as we conclude, I do want to note that we will provide the link to additional information about these changes on our Extension Team website. Plus, we'll include the link with this recorded podcast. Thanks for being on this podcast with us today, Dr. Koltes.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
Thanks for joining us today, and look forward to visiting with you on the next Dairy News and Views from ISU.
This institution is an equal opportunity provider. For the full non-discrimination statement or combination inquiries, go to www.extension.iastate.edu. usta.edu/diversity/ext.